From the moment I was born, I was cast in the shadow of my older brother, Craig. At 31, Craig was the embodiment of perfection in our family's eyes, the golden child. His academic achievements were flawless, his career was always on the rise, and he seemed to have the world at his feet. Meanwhile, I was just me. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. The praise he received was endless, while I was left to fight for scraps of attention. Even when I brought home top grades or succeeded in a project, it was always Craig would have done better. It became clear that his every move was seen as monumental, while my accomplishments were overlooked, or worse, dismissed as insignificant. The favoritism was so blatant that it wasn't just hard to ignore, it was impossible to escape. My parents spoke of him in glowing terms, while my successes were barely acknowledged. There were moments when I questioned if they even saw me at all, or if I was simply a backdrop to Craig's greatness. The weight of their indifference suffocated me, and my sense of self-worth deteriorated, as I fought to exist in a world where I was always second best. The constant sting of being overshadowed by Craig drove me to a breaking point. I couldn't stand the thought of living under his perfect, spotless shadow forever. Determined to prove myself, I made the bold decision to pursue entrepreneurship, starting my own business in modern car accessories. I poured my heart, soul, and every last penny into it, desperate to create something that would be entirely mine, something that could never be overshadowed by Craig's so-called brilliance. But my parents, as usual, were unsupportive. They mocked my dream, dismissing it as a risky venture and a waste of time, compared to Craig's stable, secure career. Their words were like daggers, but I refused to back down. The pressure from them only fueled my resolve, even as my self-doubt crept in. My father, who had always idolized Craig, couldn't fathom why I would abandon a conventional path for the uncertain chaos of a business venture. I struggled to silence their doubts, but each rejection felt like a weight pressing on my chest, threatening to crush my dreams. When I finally shared my business plans with my parents, I expected at least a shred of support. Instead, I was met with scorn. My father, the same man who had never taken the time to see beyond Craig's achievements, laughed in my face. "You're chasing a fantasy," he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "This business is doomed to fail, just like every other foolish dream you've ever had." My mother joined in, her cold words cutting deeper than I could have imagined. "If you go ahead with this," she warned, "don't expect any help from us. We'll wash our hands of you." The sting of their rejection was unbearable. They had always favored Craig, but this felt like the final betrayal. The dreams I had nurtured in silence, the passion I had poured into my work, all seemed to vanish in an instant, drowned by their cruel dismissal. But their threats didn't break me. They only ignited something deeper within me. In that moment, I realized that I no longer needed their approval to succeed. I would build my future on my own terms, no matter how many times they tried to knock me down. Despite my parents' harsh words and their attempt to crush my dreams, I refused to back down. I pushed forward with my business idea, determined to prove them wrong. Each day, I poured every ounce of energy I had into building my business from the ground up. The first few months were brutal, filled with doubt, sleepless nights, and a constant barrage of negativity from my family. But with every setback, I pushed harder, refusing to let their rejection define me. Slowly, my business began to gain traction. Orders started rolling in, and the once dismissed idea began to show real promise. As my success grew, so did the disbelief in my parents' eyes, though they were too proud to admit they were wrong. The satisfaction of watching my vision come to life without their help was indescribable. I had proven that my worth wasn't tied to their approval or Craig's golden boy status. The business that they had once mocked was now flourishing, and with it, I found a sense of independence and validation I had long been denied. In the end, I didn't just build a company. I built my own path, free from their shadow. For 5 years, I cut ties with my parents, leaving behind a relationship that had always been poisoned by favoritism and betrayal. After years of watching Craig receive all the accolades and adoration while I was dismissed, I had finally reached my breaking point. Their mockery of my ambitions, their cruel indifference to my success, and their blatant favoritism toward my brother had worn me down to the point where I no longer felt any connection to them. They didn't just choose Craig over me. They actively tore down every achievement I made, like it was a crime to rise above the shadows they cast. Even though they occasionally reached out through relatives, asking about me, I felt no desire to reconnect. Their words felt hollow, and their attempts to reignite a relationship felt like another form of manipulation. I had no space in my life for people who didn't see me for who I was, only who they wanted me to be. The pain of the past still lingered, and I wasn't ready to open the door to more disappointment. As my life progressed, their absence became less of a wound and more of a distant memory I could finally let go of. After 5 years of silence, my parents reached out to me, suddenly showering me with congratulations on the success of my business. Their message seemed like an attempt at reconciliation, but it felt more like an afterthought, a forced gesture from people who had long turned their backs on me. The words they used were thick with insincerity, a weak attempt to patch up the wounds they had caused over the years. But they couldn't erase the past, nor the years they had spent elevating Craig to a pedestal while I was left to fight for my worth. As if the timing couldn't be more ironic, they also informed me that Craig had lost his job due to company layoffs. My heart didn't stir with sympathy. After all, this was the same Craig who had once mocked my every move, the same brother who lived a life of privilege, seemingly immune to failure or hardship. Now, with his high-paying job gone, I was supposed to feel sorry for him? No, I couldn't. It was almost poetic in its justice. But still, their outreach felt empty, as if they were expecting me to come running back, ready to forgive. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. When my parents asked me to hire Craig, I couldn't help but feel a wave of anger and disbelief. They claimed he was struggling, depressed, and unable to find a new job after being laid off. They painted him as a victim of circumstances, expecting me to open my business doors to him out of some misplaced sense of familial duty. It was the ultimate irony after all these years of favoring Craig, of undermining my every achievement while elevating him to the status of a golden child. They now wanted me to rescue him. I was supposed to show him mercy, to be the one to lift him up when he had never shown the same empathy toward me. The very same brother who had belittled my dreams and mocked my struggles now needed my help. I took time to consider their request, but not out of sympathy. I weighed the possibility of bringing Craig into my business, knowing how toxic his presence could be. Would I be setting myself up for failure, or could this be an opportunity for him to prove himself? The conflict simmered inside me, but I couldn't ignore the bitter taste of resentment that followed my every thought. After hours of deep contemplation and a frank discussion with my wife, I made the decision that I would not hire Craig. Despite the years of rejection and sabotage at his hands, it wasn't just the betrayal that weighed on me. It was the reality of what it would mean to bring him into my life, into my business. My wife, always my pillar of support, was equally adamant. She reminded me that we had worked hard to build this from the ground up without anyone's help, especially not Craig's. We had struggled together, fought against the world's expectations, and proven our strength. Now we were supposed to let that fragile trust be tainted by someone who had never had faith in me, who had constantly undermined me for the sake of his own pride. I knew that even if I offered him a job, the tension would be unbearable. Our past filled with his superiority and my resentment would haunt every interaction. It wasn't just about work. It was about us as people who could never truly get along. My business deserved more than that. So, with a heavy heart, I told my parents that I couldn't help him. There was no way we could ever make it work. The moment I told my parents I wouldn't be hiring Craig, their reaction was swift and unforgiving. They exploded with anger, accusing me of being ungrateful, of clinging to petty grudges from the past. My mother's voice shook as she reminded me of all the sacrifices they made for me, of the roof they had given me over my head, the clothes they put on my back. How dare I forget all the help they had provided during my childhood? The nerve of me refusing to help my own brother in his time of need when I had been given everything. I stood there, their words cutting through me like a blade, but I couldn't bring myself to care. They didn't understand. They never had. All those years of watching Craig receive praise for simply existing while I was overlooked, belittled, and forced to fight for every inch of recognition, those wounds ran deep. But instead of acknowledging their role in the way things had turned out, they continued to paint themselves as victims. I felt a surge of anger bubbling up in my chest, but I swallowed it. They would never understand, and perhaps that was the point where we were meant to part ways for good. After the argument, I couldn't take the constant emotional turmoil any longer, so I blocked my parents. I thought it would be a way to protect myself from the endless cycle of disappointment, manipulation, and gaslighting they had put me through my whole life. But that didn't stop them. No, they quickly turned their venomous attention towards spreading lies about me to the rest of the family. They painted me as the villain, the ungrateful son who had turned his back on them after all they had done for me. They manipulated the situation to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong, twisting everything to make me look like a heartless person who refused to help his own flesh and blood. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly started reaching out, asking if what they'd heard was true. It was clear my parents were trying to turn everyone against me, to make me the scapegoat for their failures as parents. The manipulation was suffocating, and I felt the weight of the years of neglect and favoritism crash down on me all over again. But there was no turning back now. I had cut them off, and I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. Despite the relief that came with blocking my parents, a gnawing sense of guilt lingered. Every time I thought about the situation, I questioned whether I had done the right thing. Was I being too harsh? Had I truly given up on family just as they had given up on me for years? It was hard not to feel like a part of me had betrayed the very people who had raised me, even if it was clear they never really saw me for who I was. In my quiet moments, the weight of the past flooded my mind years of being overshadowed by Craig, their golden child, and the countless times I had been ignored, dismissed, or manipulated. But as much as I struggled with these feelings, I knew deep down that I couldn't let them back in. I talked it over with my wife, unsure if I was being too harsh. She listened patiently, offering unwavering support. "You've done everything you could for them," she said, "but they've never respected you. Don't let them manipulate you now. You've built a life for yourself, and you deserve peace." Her words, simple but powerful, reminded me that I had made the right choice, no matter how difficult it was to live with. When I announced that my wife and I were expecting our first child, I knew my parents would try to insert themselves back into my life. It was a bittersweet moment, one of excitement and anticipation for the future, but also an ominous reminder of the toxicity that had always lingered in my relationship with them. Sure enough, the messages started flooding in. They wanted to know everything about the pregnancy, about how they could help, and most surprisingly, they begged for a chance to be involved in the child's life. But I had made my decision years ago. Their absence had caused me enough pain, and I wasn't willing to let that happen again. I had already been through too much growing up in the shadow of Craig, the favored one who had always been the center of their world while I was left to fend for myself. Their promises of support felt empty and manipulative, a last-ditch effort to regain control over me. I remained firm in my resolve. I sent a simple, polite message informing them that I had made my peace and was focusing on the family I had built with my wife. Their attempts to reclaim a place in my life only reaffirmed the choice I'd made, one I wasn't going to undo for anyone, not even for blood. After my parents' relentless attempts to re-enter my life, I received an unexpected message from Craig. The tone was different from our usual exchanges, filled with anger and frustration. He was upset not with our parents, but with me. Apparently, they had contacted him to complain about me, and he was angry that I'd blocked them, accusing me of being ungrateful. But what shocked me even more was how he expressed his own sense of confusion. He couldn't understand why I had shut them out and accused him of trying to fix things on his own. The way our parents were trying to portray him as desperate and looking for validation from me was frustrating for him. He said it made him feel small and helpless. To him, It seemed like I had cut ties not just with them, but with him as well. But the reality was that I couldn't fix what was broken. Craig had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their eyes. I couldn't understand why he was playing the victim now when he'd always been their favored son. My decision wasn't about him, it was about the years of emotional neglect I'd endured, the years I had been overshadowed by him. And now I had nothing to give.